One thing that came up during and after the British Grand Prix of 2025 is the whole thing surrounding how Formula 1 has full wet Pirelli tyres but never seems to use them, and also the memes about how Formula 1 is too scared to race in the rain. And a few years back I did a video on the whole wet racing malarkey and appeared on a podcast to talk about it as well. Yeah, that happened. But if you study it a little bit, it's a bit more than just herped up F1 drivers too scared to race in a bit of water, and it usually comes from IndyCar fans. And this comes, ironically, after the Indy 500 was delayed because of a bit of rain. 2 years running, I might add. Race in the rain if it's not that much of a big deal. Now this is, and I can't believe I have to say this, a joke. You can put down the pitchforks. Although, an Indy 500 in the wet. I might have to try that on iRacing later. But all of it is just a side effect of the way Formula 1 has gone in the last, I don't know, 18 years or so. Not only has the aerodynamic element got bigger and bigger since I started watching in the mid-90s, the bigger problem is underneath the car. At some point in the mid-2000s, the team started looking at getting the aero from under the car as well as on top of the car, extracting downforce from the diffusers as well as the wings and everything else that they glued on. As a very basic physics lesson for what is known as the topside aero, that being the wings, air rushes over the wings and pushes the car into the ground at the expense of drag. This gives the car more grip in the corners. Turn the wings up, you get more drag but more downforce, and that's useful for circuits like Monaco, Hungary, or maybe somewhere like Australia as well. Turn the wings down, you get more top speed because the drag's been taken off, but you get a reduction in downforce. If you remember the days of the old Hockenheim, the rear wings were pretty much for show, with so little drag on them to make sure they hit the high top speeds. Monza too. But like mentioned, in the last 18 years or so, the underside of the car has been getting more and more and more attention, and I think this really kicked off when the 2009 rule set kicked in. With the diffusers, which have been a part of F1 car construction for a very long time, the teams wanted to try and get more and more from the diffuser to create more rear downforce, so they can then remove rear wing from the car and increase top speed. They increase the top speed, but still have more than enough downforce for the corners, because now the diffuser's doing all the heavy lifting, not the wing. I say lifting, pushing down. As air rushes through the channels in the diffuser, it exploits something called Bernoulli's principle, which basically means as a fluid enters an enclosed space, it accelerates and creates lower pressure. That low pressure pocket sucks the rear of the car to the ground, and the more efficient you can make that diffuser, the more downforce you'll produce. The same thing is exploited now on the ground effect cars that came in for 2022, and it all started with Colin Chapman's Lotuses in the 1970s. So when you've got all that in mind, when it starts raining, it's not just air going through those Venturi tunnels and through that diffuser exploiting Bernoulli's principle, it's also water that's going through there. So the water goes in through the channels of the diffuser and the Venturi tunnels, it accelerates, and the car gets turned into a 220 mph pressure washer, as Isaac Hadjar found out at Silverstone when he clanged into the back of Kimi Antonelli simply because he could not see him. And that's the problem. It's not the ability to keep the car on the track, they've still got enough grip, they just can't see anything. And we've seen so much happen over the years when it does start raining. It's the Belgian Grand Prix coming up this weekend, and the F1 channel will have a lot of fun posting 1998 clips, because there was that massive start pile-up, Schumacher hitting Coulthard, and Eddie Jordan dancing up the pit lane. But the Belgian Grand Prix has had other wet races that were, well, there is no other word for it, dangerous. 1966 when Jackie Stewart crashed and was trapped in his car being soaked in fuel, and 1961 where the weather got so bad Colin Chapman and Tony Rudd started begging the FIA to abandon the race on safety grounds. Then there's 2021, but that wasn't a race. But before 2021, the last race to be abandoned because it was simply too wet and just impossible to do anything was the 2009 Malaysian Grand Prix. It was a pretty insane event to have on the 10th anniversary of the first race in Malaysia. The circuit was one that was loved by the drivers, and the fans seemed to like it as well, as they drove around it on the official F1 games. And I personally liked the track, but that second last corner, that can do one. It had slow corners, faster corners, sweepers. It was a track that had everything, and it's a track that's now missed by many. And it would be cool to have it back because the moves that you could try into the first two corners could set you up for an overtake into turn 4 if you got it right. Yeah, okay, the middle sector would be a dirty air fest these days, but it would be a test of who can follow who better. And the teams arrived in Malaysia off the back of an Australian Grand Prix that had an unlikely winner. Jenson Button winning for Brawn on the team's debut, when it looked like the team that emerged from the ashes of Honda wasn't going to make it to the grid to start with. They had very little in the way of sponsors, very little in the way of budget, but they turned up, locked out the front row, and then got the 1-2, even if the race had finished behind the safety car and Barrichello had to work for it. He dropped from 2nd to 9th at the start, but worked his way back up. So that win was a fluke, right? You know, teams don't just turn up with no budget and win a Grand Prix, do they? But as they went into the Malaysian Grand Prix and they hit qualifying, it turned out that this pace that the Brawn had was no fluke. But despite the faffing around in the background with protests coming thick and fast about this so-called double diffuser that Brawn, Williams and Toyota had, the Malaysian Grand Prix of 2009 was going to be thrown into disarray anyway because of what was happening when the cars weren't running. Through sheer good fortune between the scheduling and the weather, the F1 cars were able to do all of their running in the dry. But support races and other things were all cancelled because it seemed that as soon as the F1 cars stopped running, the rain started. And it wasn't just coming in small isolated showers either. It was a full-on deluge. So much so that the track would be absolutely flooded, but it seemed that things were going to get worse and worse and worse and worse as the weekend went on. And much like at Melbourne, the Brawns were fastest, with a Brawn first in every session of qualifying. Barrichello set the initial pace in the first session, but Button bounced back, setting the fastest time in the second session, and then the all-important third session to take his second pole position of the year, while Barrichello could only muster 4th. But while Barrichello should have been 3rd due to Vettel getting a 10-place grid drop for causing a collision in Melbourne, he'd start down in 8th, taking a 5-place grid drop for an unscheduled gearbox change. And if you've seen the Brawn documentary with Keanu Reeves, you'll see that Rubens got progressively more and more and more annoyed with how well Jenson was doing compared to him. But one of the standout performances in this qualifying session was Trulli in his Toyota getting 2nd, and with the penalties applied to Barrichello and Vettel, Glock would be moved up to 3rd, with Rosberg in the Williams in 4th. So the race got underway. Everybody was watching Jenson and Jarno on the front row, but it wouldn't be the Toyota or the Brawn leading into turn 1, because nobody had factored Rosberg into this. Nico started 4th but was leading into turn 1 with one of the best starts seen at that time. Meanwhile, Alonso, who had started in 10th, made good use of his KERS system in the back of his Renault to slot into 3rd, getting in front of Jenson. At the end of the first lap, it was the unlikely quartet of Rosberg, Trulli, Alonso and Button. Hamilton was 10th behind Heidfeld, but Vettel managed to get into the top 10 pretty quickly due to being on a light fuel load. Kovalainen and Kubica meanwhile must have known what was to come, and they were out pretty early. Heikki didn't make the end of the first lap through spinning off, and Kubica's BMW blew up on lap 2, this being after Kubica took forever to get off the line. The clouds in the sky meanwhile were looking more and more ominous, and the question was when the rain was going to get here, as opposed to if. Jenson got back into the lead when Rosberg and Trulli made their early fuel stops. In those days, the third qualifying session was done on race fuel, so that explained why the Toyotas and the Williams had been a bit faster, while the Brawn was a bit heavier. A bit heavier and still able to bang in those lap times. Imagine if they'd had a proper budget that year. Either way, Button was put back into the lead when the Toyota and Williams stopped, and Button had around 4 laps of low fuel to play with before he came in for his first stop. On lap 19, the rain started to fall, but one of the drivers ended up making the switch to wet tyres a bit too prematurely. Raikkonen had pitted on lap 18 and taken the wets. It had started raining at that point, but the rain wasn't making too much of a difference at that point. Because there wasn't enough water on the track, Kimi started burning up his wet tyres and had to drive incredibly slowly to stop them getting too hot and wearing out. Button had pitted on lap 19 and he'd stuck to slicks, way more suited to the conditions, and maintained the lead once everything had cycled through. But a shot from Vettel's car as Jenson came out the pit lane showed that the clouds were not just grey, they turned, well, there's no other word for it, black. And that's when the rain started to come down. It was a normal-ish intensity to start with, but it was only raining over the back end of the circuit with drizzle in the pits, and the drivers started getting caught out by it. Piquet was off in the gravel at turn 7, Massa spun on the exit of turn 8, and Raikkonen was now nearly last due to having to drive so slowly on his wet tyres that he'd now been on for 3 laps, and he just simply burned them out. As the track got wetter, Hamilton and Webber were having a great battle, which Webber won, and then Webber picked off Heidfeld for 5th. But Hamilton and Webber were on the full wets when it still wasn't wet enough, and Glock, on the intermediates, was picking people off left, right and centre. This actually ended up getting Glock into the lead as other cars saw that the intermediates were the way to go. When Button got onto the intermediates, he caught and passed Glock as Timo came in and took wets. Was it the wrong call? Well, Ross Brawn didn't think so. So Button stayed out while Glock took the full wets, but it seemed that Glock had got the call right after all, because when he pitted, the full downpour came, and Jensen managed to keep himself on the track long enough for the intermediates to still be working and got to the pits just in time. In the interim, Fisichella, Buemi and Vettel all went off the road, and all three had their races come to an end. Barrichello and Trulli were the last to switch, and as they left the pits the safety car came out. It was now just far too wet and getting far too dark to see anything. Hamilton spun at turn 4 saying that the conditions had now become undrivable, and Heidfeld also had a spin in his BMW. And as Heidfeld spun the wheels up to get going again, the car barely moved, and there were these two large rooster tails of water just shooting up into the air. And that radio transmission from Lewis wasn't him being overdramatic. The track was now more suited for that electric powerboat racing I've seen Katie Munnings doing on Instagram, rather than Formula 1 cars. The bottom line is the cars were no longer racing. They were, well, floating is probably the operative term. And the race was stopped on lap 32 because it was simply just too difficult to drive, and it was getting dark as well. The race had started at 5 PM local time, and that wasn't helping matters either. And while we're on the subject of it being bloody wet, much wetter than it got in the West Midlands the other night to the point where my road flooded, this picture doesn't really do it justice as to how wet that race got. If you can get hold of the highlights of the race or the 2009 season review, it shows just how bad the conditions were. Vettel had spun off the road at walking pace in the grand scheme of things, while conditions into turn 4 had become borderline impossible. There's also a couple of overhead shots of Raikkonen trying to make his way back to the pits, and there's so much water being thrown around you can actually see the aerodynamics of his car working. And on Alamy, where I bought this photo, there's an image of I think Hamilton driving towards turn 1, and they might as well have photoshopped the sky out, because they were the blackest clouds I've ever seen. And you only had to look at the ending of the race to see all the flashbulbs going off because it had gotten so dark, darker than the end of the previous year's Brazilian Grand Prix. After a long delay which ate into the remaining minutes of daylight, the FIA saw fit to call the race from the results at the end of lap 31. For the first time since 1991, a Formula 1 race had been abandoned before 75% race distance, and half points were dished out, although the 1996 Monaco Grand Prix ended up using the entire 2-hour time limit. Button was classified the winner ahead of Heidfeld with Glock in third. Now Glock had actually passed Nick on track, but the countback rule saved Heidfeld on this occasion. Trulli was 4th, Barrichello 5th, Webber 6th, Hamilton 7th, Rosberg 8th, Massa 9th, and Bourdais finished out the top 10. The only person to not retire through spinning off was Kubica. Kovalainen had dropped it on the marbles on the first lap and walled it at turn 5. It was actually very lucky for Jensen that the race wasn't restarted. The rain had got into his steering wheel and fried the electronics, and I think it was the only steering wheel they had, so if the race was restarted, they couldn't make the car start up again. Well, they could probably start it up, but the steering wheel wasn't going to work, so you'd have no clutch and no gears. But what if I was to tell you that all of this could have been avoided? One thing the Australians and Kiwis love saying when F1 goes to the Far East is, "Oh yeah, finally a race at a proper time," and then tell Europeans to grow up when we go, "Ugh, a 4 AM start? Oh, no thank you." But there'd been this weird scheduling decision that meant that this race was going to end up being ended by a torrential downpour that wasn't your usual afternoon rain shower, which apparently is quite common in Malaysia. And Florida, I've heard. And FOM was already aware that these races in Asia weren't good for Formula 1's core market in Europe. The early hours of a Sunday morning aren't for everybody, and the more eyes they can get on live, the better. The Australian Grand Prix had already been run late in the afternoon, starting at 5 PM local time, and the Malaysian Grand Prix was going to start at a similar time to give Europeans a bit of a lie-in and not have to rely on a replay later on. This was the era of Formula 1 being on the BBC, having just moved back from ITV, and it would mean that Auntie might not have to put the race on again later and put something else on instead. I actually don't remember if there was a replay or not. But either way, F1 chasing TV audiences had meant that the Malaysian Grand Prix had felt the full force of the Malaysian weather. With Abu Dhabi coming onto the calendar for 2009 and Singapore coming in for 2008, it meant that night races and twilight races were a very real possibility for other rounds of the season, and this could allow for races to not be on at stupid o'clock in European time zones. The problem is, with Malaysia very susceptible to rain later on in the afternoon, having early evening or twilight races just sets things up for carnage if a downpour was to happen. And while rain usually means things will be shaken up, like Hulkenberg at Silverstone this year or Spa 1998, in Malaysia, you're looking at an outright cancellation. It should also be noted that when the downpour properly came, there was lightning seen around the track. Keith Collentine on racefans.net called it F1 being a victim of its own greed, and it was also his opinion that Formula 1 had managed to bring the sport into disrepute twice in as many races. Malaysia being run later and being more at risk of getting rained off, and a mess up with safety car rules resulting in the Ligate controversy that emerged after the Australian Grand Prix. They had the entire day to run the race in the dry, but because they were trying to chase the television audiences, they ran the race when the weather chose to piss it down. As a result, we got just over half the race completed. And it's not like they were warned, because the forecast prior to the race had even said that heavy rain was incredibly likely during the Grand Prix, but they ran it anyway. The 2001 race was also a show of what can happen if the heavens opened in a big way in Malaysia too. So F1 had a warning and chose to ignore it, but out of it we had one of Jenson Button's best drives. Yes, there's Canada 2011, but he did everything he could to lose that race and still somehow fell upwards, and there's also Hungary 2006, but this one is also where he had one of those moments where he was a lot better than people give him credit for. He kept his car on track, he judged the conditions, he saved the life in the tyres and was banging in fast laps when he needed to, so that he got back into the lead at the end of the first pit stop cycle, and managed to overcut Glock into getting back into the lead when the downpour intensified. I mean, yes, he had the double diffuser and that obviously helped, but it was funny watching the Toyota crew moving around on the grid to block Brundle and his BBC cameraman from getting a good look at theirs. It wasn't even the best double diffuser on the grid. And before I'm told I forgot to mention it, this is the race where Kimi had his ice cream. Meme. But even though F1 had its warnings you might say came as early as 1994 with the downpour in Suzuka, which later culminated in what happened in 2014, this Malaysian Grand Prix has ended up going down in history. It's still incredibly rare that we have races abandoned with half points awarded. It's only happened once since, although we did get the cancellation of that race at Imola that one year. But it's one of those things where it doesn't happen that often, so when it does happen, it's a big event. And it ended up being one of the chapters in the most underdog and fairy tale seasons in Formula 1 history, so, you know, every cloud and all of that. But should the race have started sooner so that we didn't have to go through all of this, or is it good that it went the way that it did? Do let me know down in the comments and get a bit of a discussion going. So then, a look at the 2009 Malaysian Grand Prix and how moving the race to suit Europeans ended up not giving Europeans the full show, funnily enough. If this has been an interesting video for you, then do give the video a like so I know I've done a good job, and for more stuff from this channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help keep the lights on around here or help with the image purchases or any other expenses to do with the channel, there's a link down in the description to Patreon, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and any other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Or there's super thanks for any one and done donations and memberships so you can do Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.